views expressed on this program are those of the hosts, guests, and callers, and are not necessarily those of this station, its management, or other advertisers. You're listening to Transformation Talk Radio.
Hi, welcome. This is Dr. John DeMartini. This is one of the most amazing and inspiring shows that you can listen into. If you want to be on the edge of your seats, if you want to open up your heart, if you want to expand your mind, and you want to meet incredible people, stay tuned because you're just about to experience a transformative radio show that will change your life. And you're listening to the Dr. Pat Show that's coming up right next.
The following audio is via a Skype call.
Welcome to the Dr. Pat Show. Talk radio to thrive by. Powerful, inspiring, and coming to you live, bringing you stories of people like you and me, busting through and living life full out. Get ready to dare to wonder what your life would be like if you knew you could not fail. Hey, everybody. Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so excited about today's show. Benny, a big hello to you. Guess what we're going to talk about now?
What are we going to talk about, Pat? What's up?
Banshees, werewolves, vampires, and other creatures of the night. And that's why we've got Varla Ventura in the house.
Sounds scary. Sounds creepy. Horrific.
It sounds creepy, I know.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds like the stuff that nightmares are made of for many of us. But what is really, the question is, what is our obsession with this? We are totally obsessed with it in so many ways. I mean, do you know that people were grieving over Wolverine's demise? I still don't think he's gone. I just think that's a big hoax.
They were crying over
Wolverine. Yeah, it's like, well, no, Logan, come back. Why? Why, out of all the characters we have out there, why are we so drawn to certain characters? And do we dare even mention the famous vampire? Everybody, like, what is going on? That's why we've got Varla here. But Varla Ventura joining me here today. That is the fabulous, fabulous, fabulous author of Banshees, Werewolves, Vampires, and Other Creatures of the Night, and, you know, many other books. But the question really is, I think there is an obsession. I think that we are plugging into an energy, so to speak. But what is the energy we are plugging into? And why is it that most people believe in Hollywood, if it's a werewolf or a vampire, we could pretty much make some money out of this? But how about the banshee? Why are we leaving them out? Varla, it's great to have you here. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me back. You always pose such great questions. And I mean, immediately, I think we can think of werewolves and vampires as a certain kind of archetype.
Yep.
We're obsessed with them, you know, in movies and in folklore, in oral history. We have, you know, the werewolves are sort of, you know, they're of wolves, so they have a bit of the dog, the dog-like loyalty. We are often made to sort of feel bad for, or we find ourselves feeling bad for the werewolf. The werewolf is tormented. The werewolf does not choose to be this vicious beast, but transforms almost without his own or her own control. And often you will see the idea that the werewolf actually, in a much more romantic sense, will kind of pull itself away from the ones that it loves. You know, it's like that bad boyfriend that said, "Oh, I'll just hurt you. I've got to leave." You know, so you end up with this sort of werewolf on the outskirts, looking back in, but yet still trying to fit in with society. And you kind of have a lot more sympathy for the werewolf. And with vampires, of course, we have a completely different archetype. It's a much more lusty and licentious kind of attraction. You know, the idea of immortality and this sort of like immortal behavior and the endless love that you could have with a vampire because you could both live forever. These are all kind of things that play in, that vampires are traditionally, are often depicted, certainly in Hollywood movies and in the last century, as very, very attractive and charming and, have a certain allure and ability to kind of entice you into their world. Traditionally, however, vampires did take on a lot more terrifying and kind of hideous approach, not unlike mermaids, not to derail too much, but you find that also with mermaids, that our common view toward mermaids is that they're beautiful. But there are a lot of old stories of very hideous, kind of horrifying creatures that the mermaids either transform into or they are seen upon closer inspection as being, pretty hideous and frightening.
Listen, though, it's really interesting, right? Because when we start to think about this, can I just call it the evolution of the archetype? Let's just call it that. Because if we go back and we look at some of these archetypes and we think about what was so fascinating about them, that authors wrote about them, that books were written, then movies were written, and we think about, if we just take the idea of Dracula for a moment and that character, the evolution now we've gone through, I believe, has matched the culture that we live in. So we went from this, sucky vampire, really scary, Bela Lugosi, that's real old school, that version, into the evolution of, okay, wait a minute, maybe we can feel sorry for this character, to then now the absolute fascination and admiration and lust, right, for the vampire character, right, all the way through to look at these characters and really look at what the public remembers, right? Even if we look at Interview with a Vampire, that famous scene between Brad Pitt and Antonio Banderas, that is the one we remember out of that movie, right? We don't even remember Tom Cruise. We remember and play over and over and over again that look between those two guys. What the heck is going on?
Well, and I think you also have, there was a time when these creatures were more cautionary and, don't go into the woods because there's a vampire or there's a werewolf. Now, we're quite the opposite. We go out seeking. We and younger kids, teenagers, there's this obsession with that, and less fear of things of kind of the supernatural realm. I'm not arguing that we're desensitized to it, but there's a different relationship. And so certainly the idea that these creatures have evolved with us and that, they once served one purpose and now perhaps they serve an entirely different purpose. At one point it was, cautionary and preventative, and now it's adventurous and exciting. And so there's definitely it's just such a huge shift. You go all the way back to, during the 15th century and the 16th century when people were accused of being a vampire or a werewolf in much in the same way that people were accused of being a witch.
Right.
Sometimes it was because of suspicious behavior or, diseases, but other times it was just a way to scapegoat people to take what they had. So much in the way that witches were persecuted. So our relationship now is quite different. Now we sort of emulate it. Maybe it's that, finally the vampire gets this day, not in the moonlight, not in the sun. We learned about the sunscreen in the previous hour too, so
right.
Vampires don't have to worry about that.
But it's really fascinating about this, even with that aspect of it. And let's talk about this. You have been immersed in this for years and years and years. And so I love speaking with you because you have such different perspectives on things. And, I want to ask you this question. If you had to think about what some of the most, I think, aha moments have been for you in the journey and the discovery of things, what is it that we're now finding that people love to really think about with these characters, with these ideas, but also date back in time? Like, I'm not just talking about the idea of, we wake up one day, we got television, and then what? The vampire, series. This is an old conversation. It goes back in history, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I think for me, I've always sort of enjoyed being scared. Maybe that's a product of having, grown up in an environment that was relatively safe and yet open to kind of the supernatural realm. Maybe it's just a product of my generation, watching a lot of horror films as a young kid, probably seeing The Shining at far too young of an age. But I've always kind of liked that thrill of being scared. And I do think about that. And, my approach to that has sort of changed over the years, in much the same way that people like roller coasters. And in a lot of ways, I think that while I initially believed that some of these stories were really told to keep people close to fire and keep the children from running off and slipping into the bog, my idea of that has changed somewhat, because I do think that we need distractions. And so to be truly scared or frightened in a safe environment, perhaps under the covers or snuggled up in your parents' arms as they're telling you ghost stories, is actually a wonderful distraction. It's a practice in kind of, your heart rate getting up and the thrill and the excitement, and yet knowing that that you're still relatively safe. So I do think that there's something culturally that we crave about that it's the ultimate distraction to feel scared but not actually be threatened. Most people don't want the interactive fear experience, and there are some like zombie sleepovers and things like that you can do, but that's a whole other conversation. But that's definitely something I think about, as sort of our relationship with fear and what we are fearful of. We are fearful of other things today. Maybe, we have bigger issues that we're more fearful of because we're more connected globally, and we have, the web to connect us, and we don't have to be worried about what's happening in the next village over so much, because we can, zip over there in a car and find out. So our relationship to fear has definitely changed. And in that way, our relationship to these fearsome and loathsome creatures has certainly changed.
Well, when we come back from break, we're going to talk about, what are some of the newer, let's just call them characters, that are taking the stage front. What is it now with our fascination that even gets some of these ideas and characters in the superhero realm? And what is it that we could know that's still relevant for the youngsters of today? Can we literally make friends with our demons? Stay tuned. We'll be right back.
Tune in to the Psychic Professor's Show, The Voices of Spirit Radio, with international medium and spirit artist Dr. Susan Barnes on Transformation Talk Radio, featuring a variety of spiritual topics such as psychic art, spiritualism, EVP, psychic development, and mediumship. This hit call-in show provides listeners with breakthrough wisdom to enliven and enlighten their lives. Visit spiritartgallery.net for show days and times.
On the cutting edge of the new mainstream, Christine Upchurch is passionate about bringing together science, psychology, and spirituality in a way that can be applied to our everyday lives for true transformation. The Christine Upchurch Show, stellar conversations to illuminate your journey, engages some of the most outstanding visionaries on the planet in lively dialogue to inspire you to become that bright light you're meant to be. Join Christine every Friday at 11 a.m. Pacific Time on KKNW, AM 1150, and Transformation Talk Radio.
Tune in to The Jen Royster Show, intuitive guidance to inspire your life, each Thursday at 8 a.m. Pacific and 11 a.m. Eastern on TransformationTalkRadio.com. This amazing show is an inspirational hour that will take you on an epic metaphysical journey to discover the spiritual approach to life's greatest challenges. Dr. Jen is an internationally known intuitive counselor, spiritual teacher, and energy healer. Call in for intuitive readings and visit jenroyster.com for more information.
What is a brilliant culture? And how do we create them? Why are they important? Claudette Rowley has created a breakthrough 5-step process to help you design a culture that is authentic, innovative, and successful. Learn how to create change with Cultural Brilliance Radio, the DNA of organizational excellence, and Claudette Rowley. To learn more or work with Claudette, visit ClaudetteRowley.com.
Are you ready to tap into the healer within? Hi, I'm Mary Jane Mack. Did you know the real doctor is the source that lives within you, that heals within you minute by minute every day? The healer within is the innate intelligence of the human body. When we cut our hand with a piece of glass, we don't have to command the body to close the wound and grow new skin. It knows how to heal itself. We do have to nourish the skin by disinfecting it and remove the glass, or it cannot heal. The innate healer relies upon us to assist in this healing process. Our role is to identify its needs, provide the substances required for the healing, and remove the obstacle. Contact us to achieve optimal health at 888-777-4232. That's 888-777-4232. And visit us at maryjanemack.com.
Hey, everybody, welcome back. You got any questions about werewolves, banshees, vampires? Got any questions? Want to talk with us? How have they played a role in your life? I'd love to know. 1-800-930-2819, 1-800-930-2819. You know, before we jump ahead, can we just take a minute, Varla, take a minute and let folks know, first of all, how they can find out more about you, but also more importantly, what's your social media, getting copies of the books, how do they do that?
Yes, so you can visit my website. It's varlaventura.net. And I also am on Facebook under the name Varla Ventura. And on both of those, I have links to my most recent books. You can also just look my name up on, something like Amazon or IndieBound, and you'll find all of my books, including Banshees, Werewolves, Vampires, and Other Creatures of the Night, and my more recent Fairies, Spookas, and Changelings, which I believe we talked about last time I was a guest on your show.
Yeah. Okay. I want to talk about female vampires, banshees, and women that are the villains and women that have been obsessed. Why? So do we even know? I mean, I think one of the most interesting things is when we talk about people that have written books about these characters, these archetypes, right? The question is, where do women fit in the development and the growth of the archetypal discussion here? Women. I was telling you that Anne Rice, I mean, I am just like the day I found Anne Rice was the day I really started to read. And I thought, why, Pat? I mean, what was it about it? What is it that women bring to the conversation that is different than what men have previously brought?
Well, I mean, I think we can probably credit Mary Shelley for being kind of the, the icon of female authors that sort of brought the monster forward in a whole new way. And I think that, women, of course, have a different perspective on things. So, for example, with Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, while the lead character was Dr. Frankenstein, he was obsessed with bringing life to something. And Shelley actually took inspiration for that. She had lost a child, and her grief, she turned into this she went for a while down that dark path. We saw this also in Stephen King's Pet Sematary of what would you do to bring back someone that you love. And that sort of developed into this, the Frankenstein's monster and that sort of resurrection. So we have her to sort of credit as, perhaps not the first, but certainly one of the most famous female horror writers of all time in that genre. With Anne Rice, Anne Rice brought something back that had sort of, kind of fallen out of popularity, and she brought it back with such fierceness. And she brought it back with words, and it turns out that she's a really great writer. So anyone could have written a bunch of, vampire stories. Of course, vampire stories have been published throughout that sort of, 30-year gap there between like the late 60s and the 90s. There were plenty, and I'm sure callers will be able to cite specific favorites. But she brought something back during that era, and I think you had some cultural movements that just were really happy to have that. You had the kind of the punk rock and the sort of early goths of the 70s and 80s were hungry for vampires, of course, and so they gravitated toward it. You had all the the kids of the 60s and 70s reading comic books and being kind of obsessed with the Tales from the Crypt and things like that. And she just focused on the vampire legacy and did it in such a way that it just, was kind of an, this overnight sensation. And so she really kind of transformed or maybe reminded us of what we were looking for in our vampire obsession. So she really brought that back.
Yeah. What I love about this is, let's talk about this. This is like a little chicken and egg conversation. It's like this little chicken. I like this little chicken egg thing. The chicken is a vampire, the egg is a werewolf. No, but the question really is it consciousness that allowed for the development of the archetype? Is it the consciousness of the world? So let's just put it differently. Is it the world, the outside environment, that brought forth the conversation using these characters to explain the outer world? Or is it the characters that bring forth the conversation to explain the outer world? Because, there's the old saying, on the inside, on the outside, so above, so below. Everything is connected. So where is the connection in consciousness to our view, love or hate, admire, disdain, for the idea of these characters? Because I got to tell you, Hollywood is like, we are not making a movie if we are not having superheroes and villains in it. They're just not making money.
Well, I think that the sort of, I think it's a bit of a call and response.
Oh, thank you.
During sort of like the Cold War era, when we had these I mean, I do think it kind of comes back to fear again. When we had these fears of, like, on this huge grand scale, we had, the fear that, Russia was going to drop the bomb. And it was like the Cold War.
Yeah.
Out of that, to be afraid of something as sort of countrified and old-fashioned as a vampire, maybe we became more obsessed with that because it was a comfort. I mean, it is definitely a chicken and the egg situation, because you could look at it either way. You could go back to that, that campfire scenario in which stories are used to protect and explain things in the world, or you can, go the opposite way and, say that the story was born as a response to what was happening in the world. But either way, they're both kind of at their base. I think they both come from a divine spark, especially when you're talking about literature or, any kind of the creation of art and the way that story itself specifically has evolved. Sometimes, and writers will tell you this, and I'll tell you this, sometimes it just pops into your head, and you don't know if maybe it develops because you put your own fears and your own ideas into it. What's your worst fear? Put that in a story. That's going to be a lot scarier than, your next door neighbor's worst fear. So you have that spark that kind of initiates it, and then other things add to it. So you really could look at it from both points of view, and I think you would be right in either instance. Was it a product of or a response to?
Well, I think the one thing that we can agree on is, your work coming forward and, what you're doing in the world is on the forefront of the energy that people are really sensing. I mean, let's talk about magical creatures for a moment, because, this is also, part of what you're writing about, and the kind of level of consciousness that you're bringing to the understanding. Magical creatures. I say that, and I think about this now, and I'm struck by two things. I'm struck by magical creatures can show up now in so many ways in the world to represent the antithesis of the villain energy, right? So if there is sort of this villain energy that people sense, we saw this in World War II, right? We saw the energy of what was going on during World War II, and we saw, the reign of Adolf Hitler, and then we also saw the comic book characters that developed from that. What can we expect in the age we're living in now? What can we expect? We're going to take a short break when we come back. What if you all out there had to design your own villain hero characters to depict the world we're living in now? Can we point to something going on in society today? Stay tuned. We'll be right back.
If you're one of the millions of Americans suffering from anxiety, you probably know how powerless and out of control this emotion can make you feel. This is why it is so important to remember that anxiety is created by your mind, which means that you can learn to use your mind to uncreate it. Hello, my name is Dr. Friedman Schaub. My award-winning book, The Fear and Anxiety Solution, provides you with a step-by-step breakthrough process to understand and resolve the root causes of your anxiety and build a solid foundation of confidence and inner peace. If you're ready to take your power back, visit thefearandanxietysolution.com. That's thefearandanxietysolution.com, or call 866-903-6463. That's 866-903-MIND.
Isn't it time to put your health first, to give yourself the gift of whole body wellness? What if embracing unconditional love and self-care was the first step to wellness? Could you honor that for yourself? My name is Audrey Michelle, host of Rewired Life Radio and the author of Rewired Life, A Journey to Untangle Chronic Pain and Endometriosis. In my book, I share how I healed from 17 years of chronic pain and disease. Get your signed copy at audreymichelle.com/book, spelled MICHEL.com/book.
Tune in to the Psychic Professor's Show, The Voices of Spirit Radio, with international medium and spirit artist Dr. Susan Barnes on Transformation Talk Radio, featuring a variety of spiritual topics such as psychic art, spiritualism, EVP, psychic development, and mediumship. This hit call-in show provides listeners with breakthrough wisdom to enliven and enlighten their lives. Visit spiritartgallery.net for show days and times.
Known for his keen sense of humor, contagious smile, and extensive esoteric wisdom, EJ translates deep spiritual wisdom into practical advice to empower you to live your happiest, most fulfilled experience. Mystic Living Radio, Deep Spiritual Wisdom, Practical Advice with EJ, Eliyahu Jihan. This hit show delivers profound experiences for all who want to live life to their deepest desires. Tune in monthly for Mystic Living Radio. Learn more by visiting vitaltransformation.org.
How would you like increased health and vitality? How would you like to avoid the onset of disease as well as slow the aging process? This is all possible through a simple, safe, and natural process. Every day we are either moving toward wellness or away from wellness.
Hi, I'm Mary Jane Mack. I'd like to be your partner in achieving optimal health. Contact me now at maryjanemack.com or call 425-392-0659. Visit maryjanemack.com.
Yeah, welcome back, everybody. We are talking today about banshees, werewolves, vampires, other creatures, and, joining me here is Varla Ventura. Of course, she's written several books on the bizarre and the bizarre trivia, but today we're talking about, how do we, that living our everyday lives, how do we make sense of what we're seeing that is so attractive to cultures all over the world? And, I think, Varla, what we were looking at and what the question is what will the future bring? What will the future bring? Are we going to see a resurrection in vampire-type movies, or have we actually moved beyond? And I talked about the magical creature idea, and I think during the break, I was also mentioning superheroes. Right now, women, which we started to talk about, are making their mark in movies, albeit I'm not saying equal pay because, Gal Gadot got basically $300,000 for Wonder Woman, and she ain't going to get much more for the next movie. But the impact is riveting. Children crying to get an autograph with her. So I want to ask you about this. What is it in our culture, societies, and not just in the U.S., all over the world, that are now looking at these characters to help explain what's going on in the world?
Well, I'll take it back just a moment, just to touch on banshees, because in the very beginning you kind of said, well, there's werewolves and vampires have a certain popularity, and banshees never really got their big rise. And I think part of that reason is that banshees are connected with death, and often the death or disease or fatal illness of someone near to you or near to your family. Traditionally, that's the traditional definition of a banshee, is sort of a harbinger of death. And vampires don't really represent death, although they are a supernatural creature of the afterlife. They represent immortality. And werewolves represent sort of another form of immortality and also, abilities to like shapeshift and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, today we have a very different attitude toward death than people had, 100, 500 centuries ago. But nonetheless, we still have a certain fascination with it. We do like to sort of keep it in its own category, and we don't always associate things of the paranormal with death. The rise of sort of the spiritualist movement in the late Victorian era was primarily spirited forward by women. There were many, many women who became very instrumental in the spiritualist movement, whether they were, like the Fox sisters are very famous. So they were fraudulent and admitted to their own fraudulent seances. But there were many women who found their place in society, in a Victorian society, by sort of being able to put themselves forward in a way that wasn't, what choices did they have then? They could marry well, they could be a teacher, they could, if they were lucky, they might go to college. It was, or they lived a life of, servitude. Maybe they were enterprising and had, were able to work in a shop. But everything was within the confines. And, you even have really famous women of the time, like, for example, Laura Ingalls Wilder, who didn't actually become a published author until she was in her, I think, late 40s or early 50s. So the spiritualist movement gave women this way to kind of break out of that mold, and it was in the paranormal arts. So I've always found it kind of interesting that, when we look at like the ghost hunting shows and things like that today, we don't see as many women represented in those, and yet we would not have the sort of relationship and fascination with the spirit board and the paranormal and the afterlife that we have in modern times without some of these very instrumental women. And I think that, that they had their own sort of underlying influence and archetypes. So we have the Wonder Woman archetype, which, I wore a Wonder Woman bathing suit until it fell apart when I was 6 years old. I mean, she was my goddess. Our modern goddesses are, sometimes actually very, very human and very real. And I think today we can kind of look at those archetypes. Women and young women today, and young men as well, have a different attitude toward what it means to be female or what it means to be male or what it means to be a woman or a man. And it's not that it's gender free, but there's a certain freedom in expressing your gender in a way that isn't gender specific. And so I think because of that shift, which has really been happening, it's been building up, of course, and always things build on other movements and builds on the feminist movement. But today what we have is something completely unique. It's almost as if, 15 years ago, something was unleashed from the earth that just said, hey, this is how it's going to be, and these children are going to teach you that. And so they're not quite the deciders yet, but they are the ones that are, crying when they are, finally get to meet the real Wonder Woman. And, they're sort of, in a long-winded way, I'm getting at the future, and that the future has, sort of the chance for these archetypes to perhaps be less supernatural and less make-believe and much more real and based on, the first woman who went into space and, women that drove race cars and those kind of archetypes. And so, it does take some time for those things to happen. That being said, I don't expect vampires and werewolves and banshees. I mean, we kind of go through cycles with them in popularity in terms of popular culture. Mermaids are really on the rise and when you start seeing mermaids in like every shop window, then or when you see, I always think when you, this is how you've made it as a writer. You find your book in a thrift store or in a used bookstore, because that means that they're out there enough that people are actually discarding them. That's my attitude anyway. Maybe it just means they toss them out.
Well, I mean, so I want to ask you about the idea of children versus adults. And I think the question that I have for you is, you're so close to this and you've seen the evolution of things. I want us to take a little fantasy moment and talk about, given banshees, werewolves, vampires, and any of the above. I mean, we've went from poltergeist to slasher movies to all of the above. And movies are a way of expression, but they're not always the beginning point. A lot of times it's writing, it's art, it's even music. If you were to look ahead now, what would you predict? Strange word, right? What would you imagine? Let me say it like that. What would you imagine our consciousness would call to the forefront in the way of banshees, werewolves, vampires, and anything else that goes bump in the night? What do you think is on the horizon of our consciousness to create?
Well, I actually think that we really need a good lesson in trickery. And I think that you can see by our relationship with some of our world leaders and the way that, the common person is disconnected from the grand figureheads, that we, people are just so easily offended and things are just taken out of context. And, there's a lot of things happening online that are kind of, driving this, and people are making comments and they have this sort of ability to be anonymous and mean at the same time. And it feels to me like we need a really good trickster. And maybe we have one right now and we just can't see it for what it is. But, you have the sort of trickster consciousness. It's in many different cultures. I talk about it in terms of pukas. You have Loki, you have Coyote, you have many different forms of tricksters. And in fact, a lot of fairy creatures and magical creatures love to mess around with mortal man. So if I had to sort of imagine, I could see something kind of more of a greater trickster archetype really kind of taking hold. And I think I kind of said this to you on the break that, current climate seems to be giving rise to the evil clown. And I think that we see that again in some figureheads, but also, they're remaking it. And, that is probably Pennywise is the world's most terrifying clown. I mean, there was even some hilarious, I thought it was funny where, professional clowns were very, very upset because, when the book came out in the 80s and then they did a mini series, it really gave clowns a bad name. And Stephen King had this great response to it. He said, children have been afraid of clowns since clowns first existed. I'm not going to take responsibility for, the demise of clowns. So we have like this sort of, it's the next sort of, it's been around, but it's sort of maybe the next evil thing. And I think you have just the idea that, perhaps we take ourselves too seriously and we need to take a lighter approach. And sometimes the trickster comes in to make us evaluate our attitude toward things, sort of shake us up and say, look, you think you're doing everything the right way and you're trying so hard to do everything the right way. And, you're forgetting about the basic things, which, laughter is one of the basic things that you need in life. I mean, really, it relaxes your muscles. It gets oxygen flowing into your bloodstream. I mean, it does so many wonderful things that sometimes I think we're in a mode of taking everything just so terribly seriously. And so I'd like to see some, the rise of the trickster return.
Yeah. I want to skip the break because what I'm talking about is how ideas come. I want to go back for a minute to, to Mary Shelley. Those of you out there, you can go read about, her life and so forth. But one of the things that I loved about something she said, I don't remember when, was that a nightmare gave rise to the central idea of Frankenstein, right?
Right.
And she recounted the nightmare, I think, in one of her books, and I pulled it out. And she goes on and she talks about this, but she says something like, this was an example of how the heightened consciousness of terror could be transformed into brilliant and inspirational creativity. And I have to tell you, I think that's what we're seeing. I think we're seeing it not just in the big screen. I think we're seeing inspired creativity in inventions that are being made, in clean fuel. You know what I'm saying? I think people have a form of consciousness of terror in many, many aspects, even in our financial systems. And out of that is coming this inspirational creativity. I must say that it's always fun to talk about superheroes, but the less talked about views in the world are what's rising up. What would you say about that? Do you believe that this consciousness of terror could transform into these brilliant and inspirational, in her words, creativity? I mean, she said, I saw the hideous phantasm of a man stretched out, and then on the working, some powerful engine show signs of life and stir with an uneasy, half-vital motion. I mean, she saw this.
She saw it, yeah. Amazing. Absolutely. I think that, any time, and we are in a time right now where there's so much at stake, and there are so many things that, we are led to believe are threatening us at all times. And some of those are real threats, and some of those are imagined threats. But out of that, always, out of any kind of extreme situation, out of any kind of dire situation, there are that is the the creativity happens from that. And the invention, I mean, you cannot have a cure without a disease, right? I mean, you have to have the motivation, the desire to change things. And because of that, I mean, if you even think about our world 20 years ago in terms, I mean, where I grew up in this rural town in Northern California, where a lot of people still live off-grid. But at the time, there was one guy who had solar panels. Now almost every house in that county has some form of solar. So, and that's because it's become more affordable, because the technology has developed, and because the consciousness has become more aware of that. So, clean fuel, kids aren't going to sit by and listen to the adults saying, oh, the ocean is dying. They're going to look at you straight forward and say, why aren't we doing something about it? But also, here's what we can do. And one of my kind of side things that I love to do is I love to read about like kid invented products and kid inventions, because they don't see the barriers. This goes back to our ability to see and believe in magical creatures. It actually directly ties in, because children don't see those barriers. We put those barriers on children. We convince them that they can't do things, whether we mean to or not. But over time, as an adult, you learn about the things you can't do. Now, some of that is because you jump off the stump 5 times and eventually you hit your head. And so you think, oh, yeah, I can't jump off that stump without hitting my head. But with children, and in something like a magical creature and the belief in a magical creature, they have that ability to connect, to accept, to understand that that is a possibility. They don't see how that can be otherwise. And as a result, they have a different relationship to the magical world, which means that they have a different relationship to creativity. Magical creatures and creativity are directly hand in hand. Whether you think it's coming to you, from an offering that you leave a fairy, or it's a divine spark in a dream, or it's a, sort of a relationship that you've developed with something that you believe is supernatural that is guiding you, or you just call it your muse. There's a direct relationship to the spiritual and supernatural realm and creativity. And so as we sort of evolve our understanding of that, I get asked a lot, that sounds just like an alien, or that sounds just like this UFO encounter someone had. And to me, I feel that especially with fairies and magical creatures, these sort of old world creatures, it's much more likely they've been here all along. And now we might realize, oh, maybe that wasn't a poltergeist, that was a goblin, or maybe that wasn't an alien, that was, a crazy ride with the puka, with the trickster fairy. So I guess I'm just kind of talking about that need for creativity and the suspension of belief, or rather the suspension of disbelief, long enough to allow that creative spark to happen.
Yeah. And you know, what I love about this is talking about, listen, there's a movie coming out, and, you know, what's going on underneath the surface of our thinking? Why are we having a movie that's called Geostorm about the weather being controlled and then it going out of control? I mean, you know, is this a Mary Shelley, or is this just looking at the reality? So I think there's a fundamental difference between our imagination, and I'm waking up in the middle of the night and I got a nightmare about the next archetype that needs to be brought forth, versus I'm going to do something that expresses the reality of our time. Sometimes I think there's a blurred line there, right?
Oh, there's definitely a blurred line, but you also often see literature, art, including film especially, predicting things that are yet to come. Now, is that because that artist has expressed something in the collective consciousness before it's actually happened? Possibly. But there's also a link between sort of the ability to see things in that way and create something beautiful out of it that other people can then digest. I mean, I don't think it manifests the future, because I think by that argument it's a slippery slope. It's saying that because you listen to a certain kind of music, you will become a serial killer. You know, there's a slippery slope there when you say that predictive art actually creates the manifestation of the act. But I definitely think it's a very blurred line, because, you know, you could run around chasing your tail saying, okay, so we saw this movie and it scared us, so it made us more interested in this topic, and that made more people more interested in that topic. Or why was that, you know, where did that movie come from? Did it touch into something? Did that creativity that sparked it touch into something? But there's such a process with something like a movie where, you know, it's got to be approved by so-and-so, who's got approved trends. And, you know, it's the same thing with books. When you submit a book idea, you have to tell them, you know, 5 different books that are like your book that did well and why your book is different. And that's how you convince the publisher.
Exactly.
It's like this, but it's not. So you do have to follow some past trends as well. So, but sometimes you just have to trust your instinct. And, you know, I had to fight to have Banshees forefront in the book. I said, there's so many books on werewolves and vampires, so we put Banshees first, at least. And, you know, it's definitely not the most popular topic of all of the 3. Banshees are not as well known, and they're not quite as fascinating to people as vampires and werewolves. So, you know, the publisher had a good point, but, you know, I just didn't want it to be yet, you know, there's 20 vampire books on the shelf. So
but maybe we have to redefine the Banshee. Because isn't it like a cool, I mean, when you say Banshee, it is like so totally like a visual. Imagine if we didn't know what a vampire was, right? Because what was the original pronunciation? Vampire or something like that. But when you say the word Banshee, you're like, I want to know what that is. What is that?
Yeah.
That's uh-oh.
Yeah, and the thing is that the Banshee, you know, I don't want to say they get a bad rap. They are harbingers of death, but they don't, and disease, but they are not the cause of those things. So they don't cause mayhem. And I mean, they can create mayhem and chaos, and there are sort of more malevolent Banshee spirits, but they exist to notify you of something. And it's usually the death or illness of someone in your family or very close to you. And so they, in that way, you know, they're more like ghosts than probably any other of the magical creatures. They're often, you have examples of warning ghosts and people having sort of predictive supernatural experiences where something hideous knocked on their door and they knew that was it for their cousin or whoever else was in the house. So you do have but they don't bring death. So they are not the bringers of death. They are sort of the warning, like death is coming, and you usually can't do anything about it. But the modern banshee, is certainly more of a warning than a sure thing of death, but it can also indicate, a lot of chaos or, something very grave happening. Yeah. And I have had many people come forward to me and tell me about banshee experiences that, to the best of my knowledge, very much fit the definition of a banshee more than a ghost, something that is beautiful that then transforms into something terrifying and is associated with sobbing and then a horrible scream, usually female.
Yeah. What I love about this is we get to play in our imagination. We get to have an outlet to perhaps explain things that are not explainable. Thank you so much for today. Varla, would you give out your website again? And thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. I just enjoyed talking with you so much. We could go on and on. My website is varlaventura.net, and or you can just look up my name, Varla Ventura, with 2 V's, and my books are available anywhere books are sold. They're all in print and waiting for you to buy them.
All right. Thank you for joining me. Hey, everybody, another hour on Transformation Talk Radio coming up right now.
Lights go out and I can't be saved. Tides that I tried to swim against brought me down upon my knees. Oh, I beg and plead, singing, come out of things unsaid. Shoot an apple off my head and a trouble that can be named.
The preceding audio was via a Skype call.